So returning to this engine, the engine crankshaft bearings sound okay. It's nice and quiet when I rotate the crankshaft using the connecting rod, but I'm going to have to pull this a little further apart because there is sealer here, red silicone sealer, between the transmission and the engine, so I don't know if there are any gaskets in there. So I'll pull that apart so we can put gaskets in there and put the right number of gaskets in there for the primary chain slack adjustment. And while I'm cleaning, I'm also seeing sealer on the transmission cover. So there may not be a gasket in there, and we want to pull the cover off the transmission anyway to check the internal components. Looks like this is sat in some water, so there's a bit of corrosion on the outside. But we want to just make sure everything inside looks okay. Besides the shafts and bearings, we will want to check the shift mechanism, the gear selector mechanism. The springs on it are known to fail. I've seen the horseshoe spring broken a couple of times. And I'll also want to check the timing. The sector on the gear selector is supposed to be timed to the shaft on the end of the shift fork assembly. There's a mark on the sector and a mark on the shift fork assembly that need to be matched up when it's reassembled. So hopefully when we pull this apart, all we're going to find is that we need to clean the mating surfaces between the cover and the case and put a gasket in. But anyway, we'll pull the cover off after we separate the transmission from the engine and clean those surfaces of silicone and see what we find. Here the transmission has been separated from the crankcase assembly. As we can see, there's been a liberal amount of silicone applied to the joint between the two. It's all over the studs, the threads, and there's quite a film of it here on the transmission. There are gaskets there, so perhaps this was spaced correctly when it was assembled. But anyway, we'll clean this old gasket and the silicone off here. Good news is, looking quickly in the transmission, what we can see here, it doesn't seem to be a lot of corrosion, so hopefully when we pull it apart, everything will be good in here. Anyway, we'll do a little cleaning and then pop this cover off the transmission and see what we see. Okay, so just a little something I thought I'd show as I do some cleaning on this. There were three gaskets between the engine and transmission, so I'll make a note of that and put 3 gaskets back in. But when I removed the gaskets, I found silicone here. Now, of course, silicone's been applied all over this face, which is wonderful. It's a good idea to make sure it's sealed, but the silicone that's been carefully applied here doesn't do anything. There's no pressure where this silicone is here, so this silicone is not required. So anyway, I'm not sure when this was put back together or why it was apart in the first place. If it was apart, it must have needed something. So if it got parts replaced while it was apart previously, why didn't it get new gaskets, and why was there silicone applied where it didn't need to go? Anyway, we'll continue cleaning and take the cover off the transmission and see what we see in there. Okay, so what I've done here is I've removed all the gasket material from the mating surface here. This is actually a gasket surface. And I removed the sealer from here, which is not a gasket surface. And I've gone ahead and pulled the nuts and washers, no, all except for one. There's the washer. So I've pulled all the nuts, and now the washers off of the 5 studs that hold the cover on. I've removed the transmission oil dipstick that threads in here, because that gets hung up in the gears as the transmission comes apart. And I've removed the cotter pin from the neutral indicator pinion. So that's if we can see here, we can tell this transmission is in neutral at the moment, 2 ways. The pin on this pinion is contacting the neutral indicator contact, so that's indicating neutral. And also, this is the input shaft, and the sprocket of course is on the output shaft. If we turn the input shaft, the output shaft isn't turning, so transmission's in neutral, and that's the easiest way to take this apart, is to have the transmission in neutral. It's also the easiest way to put it back together. Okay, so the gasket surface has been cleaned, other sealer has been cleaned off of it, the nuts and the cotter pin are off here. The cotter pin isn't actually required to be out of here. So what I'm going to attempt to do, and what should happen, is the cover is loose, except there are 2 dowel pins which are a tight fit to hold this cover in exact position. So it's going to require a little bit of tapping with my dead blow hammer here to get the cover loose, at least get it off of the dowels, and then I'll apply pressure to the end of the input shaft here. So we'll take the input shaft, the shift fork, and the counter shaft in here all out in one piece. And then, now as we do that, we have to be careful. There are some ball bearings that go between the output shaft and the input shaft. There are really 14 little roller ball bearings in there, so we'll have to make sure they don't disappear on us. Anyway, put this over and give it a few taps here. Okay, so it did split there. Give it a few taps on the shift lever here, and as you can see, it's not taking a lot of force. And this, I haven't had this transmission apart. Somebody's had it apart and used silicone to put it back together. That's why we're taking it apart, actually. One of the reasons we're taking it apart, I guess. So, okay, so the cover is coming quite easily there now. It's off the dowels. Well, the old gasket is in there, so they put silicone on top of the gasket. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over, because if the bearings in here fall out, at least they'll fall into the case. So the cover is going. Oh, and we've got the push rod here too, the clutch push rod that's actuated by this lever. Of course, you can't reach now because it's part way out. I'll just watch that push rod doesn't fall out. So we'll push the input shaft and take everything out. Now, still watching for those bearings. The collar is away from them, and there the bearings start to fall into the case. Always got to fall into the case. You can see in there, see the whoop, now the balls are falling out into my hand. So we'll be very careful we don't lose any of those. Let's put this back on the bench for now, and we will have a look here. So one of the reasons we got this apart is I wanted to check. Well, there's a couple of reasons we wanted to take this apart. One was we were wondering about the reason why it was apart before. We knew it was apart because it had silicone in here, like it looked like bathroom silicone. We want to check this spring here. There's a horseshoe-shaped spring, which is there and in good shape. The pawls that are in there, we want to check them. Looks like they're in good shape. See if I can get this to shift. gear position. Stiff here. Anyway, I can see the end of the pawls in there. So the pawls are in good shape. The pawls are in good shape. The spring is there, so that's good. But something else we want to check while we're in here, and I'll try to show it. There's a mark right here on the barrel of the shift fork mechanism, and there's a punch mark. I'll try to show it here in the darkness. There's a punch mark here on the sector, and those are supposed to be lined up, and they're not. So let's see if I can just wiggle stuff here and get them to line up. Should be able to move all of these up. See the oh, there we go, it jumped up. Anyway, there, the pinion has come off the shaft and the O-ring. So now we move this gear selector. So now we can move it quite easily because there's no load on it. I can see that the pawls, here, I'm going to take these shafts right out of here. So the work surface isn't the cleanest, so I'm just going to take the towel down here, get it dirty, the hammer, except hold the paper towel in place. So we'll pull these shafts out. Always one piece. Oh, and there's the seal for that push rod. Okay, so see two things here. First, we can see the punch mark on the sector that's supposed to line up on the cam, and we can see the pawls. See the pawl here at my thumb? The end of it has got a good hook on it. And move the shift sector here. We can see the pawl on the other end, and it has a good hook on it. Actually, this appears to be in very good condition. So what I'll do is I'll put this hopefully in the neutral position. Yeah, it looks like that's where it wants to be, in the neutral position. So that punch mark lines up with that tooth. Now, I haven't taken the contact for the neutral indicator off, so it'd be a little tricky for me to put the shaft back in and have the O-ring and the pinion line up, so I'm not going to worry about them. They can go on after. But what I'm going to try to do, I should say what I'm going to do, I have complete confidence that I'll be able to do it. Let's put this all back in the case, this way. Now, it almost looks like this has been put together not too long ago with grease, and possibly never used because the grease is still in position. So the tooth we want is almost in the tooth next to where this mark is, so we'll move that slightly. There we go. Okay, so now maybe we can see it. The camera doesn't like this light. This mark on the barrel is lined up with the punch mark on the sector, and if I can get that to shift. These do not like to shift. They're not in the machine for some reason, but anyway, that is where that lines up. So that's just a note. So when you're reassembling the transmission, the shafts into the cover, that mark has to line up with the punch mark. That's why they're there. If you're paying attention when you're putting this back together, you'll notice the marks, and the marks are there for a reason. So that's why they're there. They have to line up. Okay, so I don't see anything else in this transmission. It looks like it has been well lubricated. There's a little bit, I think that's just dirt on one of the gears. There's a bit of wear. I don't see anything You see anything pitted, chipped? Little bit of minor pitting on that gear, but nothing serious. So I would say I'll take this old gasket off and clean the silicone off. Put those balls back in the finger over the end of it, so none of them fall out. Those ball bearings live in the output shaft, inside the gear in the output shaft. So they'll all have to go back in there. They should be held in with a little grease. Oh, now I'm throwing them away. Be careful, I say to everybody, and then I throw them away. There's a bearing and seal in there. It doesn't feel like the bearing's rough, so I'm not going to take that any further. Well, I may take the output sprocket off so I can change the seal. But other than that, I think this transmission is in pretty good condition. Okay, so I'm going to put that down before I lose any more of the rollers out of it, and shut the camera off and find the ones I dropped, and I can clean that gasket surface and put it back together whenever I'm ready. I have a new gasket for the transmission side cover. I'll put that on, and that's about it. So I'm going to put a little grease on those rollers. Sorry, put a little grease in the output shaft, put the rollers in. I'm going to put a little excuse me, a little Power Sport gasket maker here, some sealer, just a light smear. Actually, I'm going to put it on the gasket. Then I'm going to put the gasket on the case. Put a little bit of oil in the bushings, and then assemble the case, slide everything together. But anyway, when I have the bearings in place and the gasket on, and I'm ready to slide the whole thing back together, we'll come back and I'll record that momentous event.
Oops. That photo, which you just saw a glimpse of, where the side cover of the transmission had the gasket with the sealing material applied to it, that was supposed to be the video of the transmission case going together. Unfortunately, I didn't notice that I had pushed photo instead of record video until the transmission case was together. So, although I'm not going to pull the transmission back apart so I can show you how I assembled it, I have another transmission case here, and I can point a few things out that to watch for, and explain how a few things were done as I assembled the other transmission. Okay, so now this transmission isn't complete, but I just want to show a few things here. This is the cover, and inside the cover, where the gear selector shaft comes through, in this area here, there should be 2 rows of cylindrical roller bearings with a washer on it. Now, if you have the transmission apart, the easiest way to put those in and have them stay there as you're assembling the transmission is to apply some grease to this area, put the rollers in. There'll be 1 row at the bottom here, and then another row that comes up pretty much flush with the edge of this bushing, and then a little bit of grease between the end of the rollers and the washer, and you set the washer in place, and the grease acts like glue and will hold the bearings in the washer in place as you assemble the shaft into the case. Now I'm going to show this right on the case and on the pinion. I mentioned that when you assemble the shift assembly, the shift fork assembly with its pinion and the sector shaft, there are timing marks. Now it's hard to see on this rusty shaft here. Maybe you can see right at the tip of the screwdriver there is a punch mark. which lines up with this tooth. And if we look at the pinion on the shift selector, there is looks like a chisel mark right there, which corresponds to an area between two teeth. So to line those up, now there's no bearings in here, so it's going to be hard for me to line this up. So if that sector is put so that tooth, which lines up with that mark, is set about center, so that it's hard to see in the camera, but the punch mark lines up with that tooth, and that tooth is between these other teeth, and that tooth lines up with this mark. I'll show you in the manual here, it's a little easier to explain maybe. So anyway, that's how I would put the rollers in there, which support the end of that shaft. And speaking of rollers, now this is the case. Now in the case is the transmission output shaft. It's a short shaft here with a sprocket on it and one gear. And in this gear, I'll try to show it. In this area in this gear is a place for ball bearings. Now the shaft that goes in through here, the input shaft, there's a collar on it that sits down against the rollers that go in here. And to hold those rollers in place while you assemble the transmission, the easiest way to install the transmission case to the cover is to hold the cover with the shafts sticking up and slide the case down over it. And if you do that without doing something with the rollers that go in here, of course they're all going to fall out. So if you just put some grease in here, now I use a synthetic grease which happens to be clear. That way I can see what I'm doing. I can see all the rollers that are in there, and it's a little nicer to work with. I don't get all black or green or whatever color grease I may have. And so the rollers go in there. You can turn the cover over if they're held in with grease and assemble them. Now I'll just go through a few things in the manual here. I'll just set this stuff out of the way and grab the manual. Now I have several manuals I refer to. They're very handy when you go to take something apart or put something back together. So what I have, I'm working on the Penguin ATV. So I have the Penguin parts list. Now this parts list is available online, and I have original copies. I've photocopied it and put it in this binder in the plastic sleeve so pages don't get all greasy if I'm using it while I'm working on it. So I have the Penguin parts list. I have operating instructions and component parts list for the SEBA Dynastart. The reversible single type that fits a 9E4 SFR. So that's the engine we're working on. It's a 9E 4-speed fan-cooled reversible. So that gives us a fault finding chart and exploder diagram, parts lists. And I also have Villiers Road Vehicle Engines Maintenance Manual. It covers the 9E. Gives specifications, instructions on dismantling and reassembly. Very handy. And the manual I have is now this says Norton Villiers. Villiers became Norton Villiers. So this is a Norton Villiers replacement parts list, which covers the 9E, which is the engine we're working on, and it is very handy. It shows all the parts that should be in all the 9E engines, so there are things in here that don't suit our engine. For example, the armature plate and flywheel, where we have the SEBA Dynastart and points, 3-speed transmissions, etc. Now, one thing I'll show here, if we look at the Penguin parts list and go to the transmission section, here is the transmission output shaft. Here's the collar I was referring to. So inside this gear, this end of the shaft, and against that collar there should be 14 ball bearings. This parts list does not list, actually, it lists a ball, item 33, where would item 33 be? No, that's not the ball we're looking for. That's part of the peg and spring for the shift forks. So this does not list the ball bearings that are there. If we go to the parts list, the Villiers parts list, now again, this is sideways, but here's essentially the same picture. The output shaft with the collar, no bearings called out, but if we go to the list, there's the pressure washer, which is item 23, which is the collar, and 22 is the pinion, which is the pinion on the output shaft. Listed here with no illustration number are quantity 14 3/16 inch diameter balls. So those are what we would be looking for when we take this transmission apart and put it back together. We would be looking for 14 3/16 diameter ball bearings that would go in the output shaft against this, and the inner spot of this pinion, and this collar would hold them in. Now, what else have we got that I want to show you? Oh yes, the timing marks. Timing marks, this might show it a little better if I can get away from the reflection. So there is the sector. It shows the mark here, which lines up with a tooth on the sector, which falls between two teeth, of course, on the pinion where the mark is. So it's important to have the timing marks lined up when reassembling the shift selector shaft to the pinion in the transmission cover. And the easiest way to have everything line up easily is to have the transmission in neutral. So when you take the transmission apart, if everything's set so the transmission is in neutral, you can test that by spinning the input shaft. The output shaft should not spin. And if everything's in that position when you take it apart, if you note how the shift forks are and can set everything back that way when you put it together, it makes things go a little easier. But anyways, sorry about again the slight technical issue we had when I pushed photo instead of record video, but the transmission cover and case go back together quite easily if you first of all make sure your timing marks are lined up, and the 14 rollers, the ball bearings in the output shaft are held in with grease, and the gasket is set on the cover with a little smear of sealing compound on it before you attempt to put the two together, the case and the cover. And then we can go show how we tighten the cover onto the case and continue on from there.
These nuts nicely fit a 9mm wrench, so I'm just going to make sure they're all more or less seated, and then just snug them up. The manual says in a diagonal pattern, so general idea is don't tighten one up and then tighten the rest of them up. So I'm working from one end to the other here. They're not very large, so I'm not in a lot of force. Just trying to make sure I use about the same amount on each one. You can see I'm not even holding the wrench by the end of it. Okay, so that's the transmission case on. Oh, good. Still in neutral. The transmission shaft still rotates. It is in neutral. The input shaft and output shaft are not rotating together. Okay, so now we know the transmission is back together. It's back together correctly. And it has a new gasket and some proper sealer. It has oozed out just a wee bit to show us we have enough. Now, I didn't put any sealer in this area up here because that's anything above this area right here. It doesn't need to be sealed, so I didn't put any sealer there. As long as this area behind here is sealed, this area here. So anyway, new gasket, sealer, nuts are all on. The O-ring here and here will have to be replaced. This bridge assembly will have to come off when this transmission is reinstalled, so that we can set the amount of the push rod is protruding here. But anyway, the transmission we know is in good shape, and I'll actually just pour a little oil down in here to make sure everything's lubricated. Anyway, the transmission is more or less back together. After I put a little oil in this transmission case, now it seems to want to shift, although not quite as easily and smoothly maybe as it will in the machine when everything's spinning, and I've got a little more leverage with the shift lever. But anyway, I'll try to show how the shift forks move. It's hard to see one of them because of the transmission case, but anyway, we'll run it through the gears, as they say, and see what we see. Anyway, right now it's in first gear. When the input shaft turns, the output shaft is turning. Now first gear is up, which should be pulling forward. So second gear, now actually we'll probably return it to neutral. Oops, we went right into second gear. Okay, so first gear. Okay, there we're in neutral. Two ways we can tell we're in neutral. The input shaft's turning, output shaft isn't turning, and the pin on the pinion is on the contact. Okay, so we'll push down a little further. Now, of course, the gears have to line up so they will go in there, so sometimes we have to turn the input shaft a little bit. So that should be second gear. Input shaft and output shaft are turning again. So that's second gear. Third gear. Input shaft, output shaft turning. And then fourth gear. Now, I know it's not right in fourth gear because I can actually see this gear and this gear aren't locked together, so I'll turn them so I can see that there's room for the gears to go together. Push again, and we're in fourth gear. The input shaft and output shaft. Output shaft is here, input shaft is here with this gear locked to it, and now these two gears are locked together. So this is turning one turn input shaft, one turn output shaft. So now, if we go the other way, trying not to get my arm in the way here. So we can see the two shift forks are far apart. So if we pull there, now we're not in a gear, so okay, there. So the shift forks are together, and we can see the shift fork on the left a little bit there, so that should be third gear. And then, remember which direction I'm going, turn it a little bit here. Really stubborn, there we go. And that is in a gear. That should be, oh, that's not quite in a gear. This demonstration is demonstrating more to me. Okay, so there we're in, that should be second gear, I think. This shift fork is more visible, and this one is over more a little bit to the right, and there's a gap between them. So next we're in neutral. Input shaft turning, output shaft not, and the shift forks are apart again. And then to go to first gear would be pulling up on the lever, so it should be this way. And we're in first gear. This fork is visible, the other one has disappeared out of view. So there's first gear. And again, put it back in neutral carefully. There we go. So the transmission goes through its gears, everything turns. It's hard to hear the bearing and the output shaft with the transmission together because of the noise of the gears, but I spun this one. We had the transmission apart. I didn't notice any noise in the in the bearing. So it's all back together. Everything's smooth, it's shifting. We know it's clean in there, the shift mechanism works, it's timed correctly. It should get a seal. Again saying that it should get a seal on the output shaft, and there should be a seal here on the inner chain case cover when the engine's put back together. This bridge will have to be removed to set the proper length of that shift rod. And some new O-rings on this shaft and that shaft. Anyway, the transmission doesn't need any more disassembly, at least not to get at the gears.